Thank you for attending the Climate Science for Non-Scientists program presented by Dr. Alan Journet. The views expressed in this program do not necessarily represent the views of Jackson County Library Services.
Thanks a lot, Carrie, and welcome to this afternoon's program in the series Climate Science for the Non-Scientists. The topic today is what we can do individually and collectively. So let's start the ball rolling. If you have any questions and you'd like to contact me, you can see my email is right there, alan@socan.eco. And right at the bottom there, you can see the URL for Southern Oregon Climate Action Now. What I'm going to be doing this afternoon is talking largely about three questions. What are the main human behaviors causing greenhouse gas emissions and thus global warming and the climate crisis? What can we do individually to reduce these emissions? And what can we do collectively to address these emissions? And we'll be looking at international or global efforts, national, regional, and local. So let's start the ball rolling with what is it that we are doing that's causing greenhouse gas emissions? And let's first remind ourselves what the greenhouse gases are. The first one is the one that most people are familiar with, is carbon dioxide, which has a longevity in the atmosphere of centuries to millennia. And what you can see listed there is what's called the 100-year global warming potential. And I'll explain what that means right away. Greenhouse gases are awarded each of them their own global warming potential, which is a measure of the relative heating capacity of that gas compared to an equal weight of carbon dioxide. So since carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide, its global warming potential is 1. This term, global warming potential, is also known as the carbon dioxide equivalent, usually abbreviated as CO2e. And you will hear either term used quite commonly in among people talking about global warming and greenhouse gases. We then have methane over here, which is a greenhouse gas that has a longevity in the atmosphere, as you can see, much less than carbon dioxide, about a decade. Because it's so short-lived, methane is awarded two global warming potential values. One, 100-year global warming potential value, which makes it 34 times worse as a heating agent than carbon dioxide. And the other is a 20-year global warming potential. And you can see under that basis, its potential is 86 times greater than carbon dioxide. And as we come down here, we see another one of the top three, as it turns out, the top three greenhouse gases. Another one is nitrous oxide. This has a longevity of about a century, so we simply award that its 100-year global warming potential, and you can see that's nearly 300 times worse than carbon dioxide. Now, when we're talking about global warming and the greenhouse gases, we tend to focus on carbon dioxide, as you will see in a minute or two, largely because there is more of it than there is of the other gases. Although its global warming potential is the lowest of the ones we've looked at, and as you'll see in a minute, the lowest of the greenhouse gases, because there's so much more of it, it's the one that has the greatest impact. Now, I shouldn't forget that water vapor, if you're kidding somebody around, you could call it dihydrogen monoxide, H2O. That has a longevity in the atmosphere of about 10 days. It is a global warming gas. However, because of its longevity in the atmosphere being so short, it's more a consequence of warming than it is a cause. And by that I mean what happens is, as the temperature warms, evaporation rate increases, and so water evaporates from the soil, from rivers, lakes, the oceans, and increases the concentration of the greenhouse, that gas in the atmosphere, and that does indeed exacerbate the warming. But it's the other gases that are the primary drivers, and if they reduced in concentration, then the temperature would drop and the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere would also drop. Indeed, the humidity across the planet has increased about 5% over the last century or so, and that's a function of the warming that's been happening. The other set of greenhouse gases are the chlorofluorocarbons or hydrochlorofluorocarbons. These, as you can see, have a longevity actually measuring in the decades to hundreds of years. And they have a global warming potential that is huge compared to the other gases that we have listed here. You can see it's 5,000 times or worse or more in terms of the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. What we're looking at here is the concentration of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since 1979 or so. And what you can see is the carbon dioxide concentration has been rising quite substantially. Methane may be rising a little, and then you can see the darker red is nitrous oxide, and the other two are the chlorofluorocarbons, chlorofluorocarbon 11 and 12. And then there are some other minor gases. What's interesting, and I'll depict here, is that the National Oceanographic and Aeronautical Association, you can see down here on the bottom right-hand side of the chart, this is where this chart comes from. What they have done is developed this measure called the Annual Greenhouse Gas Index, which is a measure of the warming caused by the gases compared to what it was like in 1990. You can see 1990 over here, sort of middle left, is defined as 1. And then what we're doing is comparing warming both before and after that. But an interesting idea, which isn't illustrated basically on this NOAA chart, is how much of the warming is due to gases that are not carbon dioxide. And it's worth pausing for a moment to think about that. If we look at the index value, which you can see a 43% increase above 1 puts it at 1.43, the other gases are responsible for about 0.5 of that index, and that's what's illustrated by this parenthesis. If we look at the amount of warming and the concentration of greenhouse gases that have increased since 1990, we can see that the warming due to the other gases is 0.5 of the 1.43 of warming that is recorded by this greenhouse gas index. That's somewhere between 35 and 40%. In fact, I don't know why I've got 0.3. Well, 0.35 equals 35%. And so that's a 35 to 40% of the warming, and this is the point, is due to gases other than carbon dioxide. And so the message that I'm trying to convey is, if we are going to address in a meaningful manner the global warming that's happening, then we have to address all the greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide. So let's ask the question, which is an important question: where did these come from? Well, the most often understood source of greenhouse gases is the burning of fossil fuels. That's the main cause for the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. On the left-hand side, we have coal, and you can see what happens with coal. It gets harvested, and there's an ugly open pit mine. In case you don't know what coal looks like, there's a nice pile of coal, and that gets burned in utilities to generate electricity. We also have oil and gasoline, which of course are also fossil fuels, and on the right-hand side, natural gas. So let's ask the question, what is it that results from the extraction and use of these fossil fuels? Well, the answer with coal is it's largely carbon dioxide, although to a small extent methane is emitted as a result of coal mining. For oil and gasoline, again, largely carbon dioxide, although when we combust fossil fuels, we do emit some nitrous oxides. And the natural gas, the major consequences of our use of natural gas are methane and carbon dioxide. Natural gas, incidentally, is about 90% methane, And the problem is from its extraction, from the natural gas extraction through fracking, a substantial amount of methane actually just leaks. It doesn't make any sense, but it does, and they don't seem to be able to stop it from leaking. And if you recall the global warming potential of methane being so much greater than carbon dioxide, you'll realize that it doesn't take much methane to leak before we have a huge problem. It turns out that when we burn natural gas, we do emit less carbon dioxide than when we're burning coal or oil to generate energy. But the amount of methane that leaks as a result of fracking pretty much negates that benefit. The other things that we do that result in greenhouse gas emissions are land use conversion, particularly, of course, the conversion of forests to agricultural land when we essentially volatilize the carbon dioxide, the carbon into carbon dioxide that's in the forests, and also in our agriculture and forestry activities. As we farm and as we engage in forestry, we're also emitting greenhouse gases. So this gives us a pretty broad brush image of what it is that we are doing that results in greenhouse gas emissions. Let's look at this in terms of pie charts. These are relatively simple ways of looking at the total amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted and what percentage come from what behaviors in which we engage. Power stations, that's, of course, the generation of electricity. Power stations are responsible for a relatively large proportion of those emissions. Industrial processes are responsible, and transportation fuels are responsible. So those are the big three things that we do that result in greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason that I'm showing this is so that folks can see, just think about what it is that we do individually or collectively, and you can start to see what it is that we're doing that results in these emissions, and therefore what we can do, adjust in our behavior if we wish to reduce those emissions. Along the bottom here, I'm going to demonstrate that not all gases result from the same three critical activities. Carbon dioxide, you can see, the largest amount of carbon dioxide comes from power stations, industrial process, and transportation. They account for about 75% of the carbon dioxide emissions. If we're looking for methane now, the major consequences for methane emissions are the light green agricultural processes and the light lilac, I guess we'd call it, fossil fuel retrieval, processing, and distribution. So those are the major causes of methane emissions. And then if we're looking for what causes nitrous oxide emissions, what we find is it's largely agriculture and the dark green land use and biomass burning. So if we're looking to reduce our nitrous oxide or our methane emissions, it's not entirely the same target processes that we have to look at if we are, as if we are trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So what this does is give us a clue as to what it is we should be doing if we want to reduce our emissions again, and that's the focus for this first segment. The main global greenhouse gases and their sources, this comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2014. Our behavior hasn't changed very much on a global basis since then. And what you can see, this is measured in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent or global warming potential. What you can see is carbon dioxide accounts for both, for the largest proportion of the emissions, 65% from fossil fuel and industrial processes, and about 11% from forestry and other land uses. Methane is down at 16% and nitrous oxide at 6%, and other gases down around 2%. On the right-hand side, what we can see is, again, what it is that we do that results in these emissions. And what you will see, again, is that electricity and heat production are accounting for 25% of the emissions, industry 21%, And then agriculture, forestry, and other land use, they're up at 24%. We should not underestimate them. Transportation at 14%. This is on a global basis. What we're looking at now is US greenhouse gas emissions over the period 1990 to 2014. What are they? Again, you can see the big winner is carbon dioxide. Methane comes in second, nitrous oxide, and lastly, the fluorinated gases. And you can see on the left-hand axis, this is measured in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is the global warming potential impact of those different gases. Again, you can see carbon dioxide is the major cause, but you can also see the other gases are contributing a not inconsequential amount to the problem. Here we have the US greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. What this is now telling us is, so with these two charts, we can see on the left-hand side what the major gases are, on the right-hand side, what it is we do that causes the problem. So again, utilities, power plants generating electricity, transportation, industry. So these are the big three contributors to our problem. Agriculture is in there. Commercial and residential activities are in there as well. So these three items down at the bottom, agriculture, commercial, and residential, are non-transportation, non-utility causes for emissions. And these put some percentages on those various activities. And that gives you a good sense of what it is we have to consider if we're going to try and reduce our emissions, whether individually or collectively. Let's look now at the US greenhouse gas emissions in carbon dioxide equivalent in 2018. This tells us nationally what the main greenhouse gas emissions are. Carbon dioxide is the biggie, methane and nitrous oxide, you can see. This now brings us to Oregon, getting a little closer to home. Looking at these gases in terms of what it is that we're doing in Oregon that causes their emissions. Our total greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon, measured in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent or global warming potential, is about 64 to 65 million metric tons. And you can see the major contributor of the regulated greenhouse gases, and by regulated greenhouse gases, I mean the greenhouse gases that are measured by the State Department of Environmental Quality. Transportation is a biggie. You can see the next one up is designated electrical use. But that's not really true. Unfortunately, and I don't quite understand, when DEQ gives out these data, they call it electricity use, but it's not. It's actually electrical generation that's the problem. When you turn a light switch on and it lights a light bulb or drives the vacuum cleaner or the stereo, at that point, it's not resulting in greenhouse gases. It's the generation of the electricity that's used for those activities that results in the greenhouse gas emissions. If we come home to the Rogue Valley now, this study was conducted about 9 years ago now, 2011. I suspect things haven't changed much since then. This is measuring the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that result from what we do here in the Rogue Valley. And the item that's somewhat new here is this category called stuff, materials. This is our consumption. And the reason that's relatively high is because when we buy, say, a car made in Detroit or a TV made in China, the emissions that result from that manufacture and shipment to us are charged against us. So that's why our consumption, our materials and stuff values are so high. Transportation, you can see, is up there, and energy production, that's utilities again, that's pretty high as well. So this has introduced a new idea, which is going to help us when we start thinking about what we can do individually. It's our consumption that's a big contributor to the problem. The message. What human behaviors cause most emissions? Transportation, you can see, is a biggie. Electrical generation, that's the utilities, burning fossil fuels. Natural gas, fossil fuel leakage particularly, and the combustion of the natural gas. Residential and commercial activities, the non-electrical, non-gas activities. Industrial processes, and the big one that was introduced at the end there, consumption. Okay, pause for questions.
So we don't have any questions yet for those who are attending. If you have any questions, please put them into the question and answer box.
Okay, well, this is the chat box, I think, isn't it?
I think it's question and answer box.
Oh, you got a Q&A. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move forward. So now I'm going to try and address very briefly what we can do individually to reduce these emissions. And what I would like to start by pointing out that the continuation from the previous segment is the big things that we do that result in emissions are our transportation, combustion of fossil fuels, our use of electricity, and our consumption. And so when we're trying to think of what we can do individually, those are the three biggies that we should be thinking about trying to adjust our behavior. Okay, so back in the day, certainly when I was a kid, I had no idea, maybe true for many of you, had no idea about global warming because it wasn't well understood when I was younger. Back then, what we focused on was the idea that if we considered money, we just consider money inflow and money outflow. If money in was greater than money out, everybody's happy. Things are perfect. Life is a charm. But the key now is that we have to think in terms of more variables than just balancing the money budget. We have to start thinking about other budgets in our lives, particularly the energy budget. So we need to start thinking in terms of our energy consumption and where that energy comes from, particularly focusing on what is emitted as a result of the energy that we use. Greenhouse gas. So we have to start doing some greenhouse gas accounting, particularly in terms of the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and any other greenhouse gases that are emitted as a result of our behavior. A good other behavior that we need to think about is the refrigerants that are chlorofluorocarbons. We've got to be careful about emitting them into the atmosphere. Now, I will say I suffer from a condition. The condition is called hopium. I got this condition back in 1995 when I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, and I was given at that point, absent treatment, I was given 2 months to live. And then I was given some graphs which showed if I went through 4 rounds of chemotherapy, total body irradiation, and a bone marrow transplant, that I had a 50% chance of being alive in 2 years. So I've been through the ringer in terms of life-threatening conditions, and I came through it. And what I realized was what I've got to do as I'm in that position is be in the 50%. And so that's where we have to be, and I'm not saying our chances are 50%, just we have to be in the percentage of that leads to success into the future. So I have hope that we can do it, and the technology tells us we can do it. But what is it we can do individually to reduce our emissions? Again, let's go back to the 3 biggies: transportation, electricity consumption, and buying stuff. I'm not going to focus on all the things we can do. I'm going to actually give you a link to a document that we produced at Southern Oregon Climate Action Now, which gives you a 2-page kind of summary of things you can do individually. I'm just going to mention a couple of items about which people often ask questions. The first one is electric vehicles. People often say, well, are electric vehicles really a good idea? because in many cases, the electricity that's powering the electrical vehicle is actually produced from a coal-fired power plant, which is resulting in greenhouse gas emissions. Clearly, if we are powering our electrical vehicle from solar energy that we're trapping on the roof of the house, we're way ahead of the game. But what this chart is telling us is the difference, and this is looking at over the full life cycle from the manufacturer to the disposal of the products at the end of its life, that we get, if we instead of driving a mid-size gasoline car, we drive a mid-size 84-mile battery-driven electrical vehicle, we're getting a 51% life cycle reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. If on the other hand, we think we need a full-size car, if we trade in our full-size gasoline car for a full-size 265-mile battery-driven electric vehicle, then we're getting a 53% reduction. So the point I'm making here is, even though we might be getting our electricity, in some cases, from coal-fired power plants, electrical vehicles are better. Another aspect which is worth considering, which is going to be displayed here, is the question, what's in your wallet? We get that question from, I think it's Capital Bank. Always worth asking the question, what's in your wallet? We don't always think about our bank accounts as being contributing to the problem, but they do. What I've listed here is a whole bunch of banks, and you can see as we get past the first 5, we're into the big banks, US Bank, Wells Fargo, et cetera, et cetera. So these have been graded by Green America in terms of their environmental impact. B Corps are corporations, I should point out. B Corps are corporations which focus not just on profit as their bottom line, but also on environment and social justice. The Global Alliance for Banking Values is a particular banking organization that has the same principles, operates on the same principles as B corporations. So let's look at, excuse me, how our banks rate. There are 5 at the top, and you can be forgiven if you're not familiar with those 5. They rate A in terms of their environmental sensitivity. But as soon as we get down to the big banks, you can see the grade is way down. Nobody gets a B. We jump down to C's, D's, and F's. And so the recommendation is, if you bank with Bank of America, Capital One, or Chase, really it's time to think about whether you can find a better bank. And these banks up here are the best. Not necessarily so easy to find, but and they don't have a bank bank just down the street. Electrical banking is the way that these operate, and that's how we work ourselves at home. So in terms of the volume of complaints, you can see the A-rated bank don't get complaints. They do a very good job. As soon as we get to the other banks, we start getting complaints against them. But here's the key issue. Where do they stand in terms of investing in coal utilities or coal mines? The answer is, most of these other banks actually do invest in these activities. And so what we're finding is most of these other banks are really not good places. If we're concerned about global warming, they're not good places to be carrying our home mortgage or our bank account or a credit card. This is an interesting question, and one that not many people actually stop to think about, but it's worth thinking about if you have a chance. This chart gives us a quick summary of what it is that has low to high impact in terms of reducing our footprint, and I'll talk about what footprint means in just a moment. So at the low end of the scale, we can upgrade our light bulbs to light emitting diodes. It does have a benefit, but it's a relatively small one. We're not going to solve the world's problems by all changing to light emitting diodes, but we can make a difference. We can, instead of using a clothes dryer, we can hang our clothes out to dry. We can recycle as much as we possibly can. Wash our clothes in cold water, not hot water. Switch to a hybrid vehicle. Switch to a plant diet. Now we're getting up into the higher impact arena. Switch to being totally car-free. Not always possible, but reducing car use as much as possible is good. Buy green energy, that's energy that's not generated from combustion of fossil fuels. And this is a big one. Avoid aircraft. Try and stay away from flying if you possibly can, because one of the standard arguments that we've heard for years and years is if you do everything you can for a year and then you hop on an aircraft, you've almost totally negated everything you did for that year. So try and stay away from aircraft. Live totally car-free. And here's the biggest thing that we can do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Don't have as many kids, because for us, each kid that we add to the population is going to contribute a considerable amount of greenhouse gas emissions over that child's life. So better to have fewer than more kids. Now, rather than giving you an extended list of things to do, I'm simply going to direct you to some tips that are on the SOCAN website at socan.eco/action, and this table gives you some of the areas for these tips. The discussion I just offered about banking is in here, so that would be a place to go if you want to review that discussion. So pop over to socan.eco/action, and you will get a pretty good 2-page summary of the things that you can do, and there are other sources of information there that I think you might find useful. I mentioned a few moments ago the idea of a footprint. One of the things that we can do, and it helps us individually figure out where we stand in terms of our lifestyle, is assess the greenhouse gases that result from our standard life. These are often called carbon footprints, but they are not just measuring carbon emissions, they're measuring greenhouse gas emissions in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent. They're an excellent tool because what they do is you feed them information on what you do on a daily basis or an annual basis, and they will tell you where you stand in terms of your greenhouse gas emissions. There are many greenhouse gas or carbon footprint assessments out there. There's one that we use at SOCAN, which is the Cool Climate Berkeley calculator. And this is the website, worth a trip, worth a visit. It's relatively user-friendly. And so go to it and give it a shot. And what it will do is, if you go to that website, you have to give it a few seconds to cycle through, and it will open this page. And what you can do is start filling out the information on this page, and then click on travel, home, food, shopping, blah, blah, blah. And what it starts off by doing is asking you where you live, how many people are in your house, and what your gross annual household income is. And then it will give you an amount of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year that is the average emissions for people who live with your number of people in the household and your income in your zip code. And then as you start filling out these other categories, what this will do is start giving you a more detailed assessment of how you actually perform. And if you're doing a reasonably good job, what you will find out is your total carbon dioxide tons of equivalent per year is going to be lower than the average person in your community. If it's about the same or higher, then what you would probably consider doing is going to this take action option, because what this will do is give you a list of things that you can do in each of these areas to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a really neat tool, in my judgment, for helping us individually reduce our emissions. Okay, back to this chart. The point that I want to make again with this chart is we have choices individually and collectively. And what I've tried to do is give you some tips on what we can do individually to address the problem. But, and this is the bottom line here, although the cumulative impact of millions of painless choices can be immense, individual action is necessary, but we actually must do more to address the problem on a state, national, or global level. Okay, how are we doing, Carrie?
Pretty good. We had one question.
Okay.
They asked, how do your recommendations compare with drawdown?
We use drawdown frequently in the courses and classes that we teach. I think you'll find that they are parallel with a lot of the kinds of things that drawdown talks about. Drawdown tends to be more of a larger scale set of recommendations than individual, although it does touch on that. And so drawdown would probably be more closely related to where I'm going to go with collective action in just a second.
Yeah, that was the only question we have had so far.
Okay, and I am totally not going to denigrate drawdown in any way. I think it's a valuable way of looking at it, and it certainly does give us some big picture areas of things that we can do to reduce our emissions. Okay, so let's go to the third section. What can we do collectively to address these emissions? Just going to talk very briefly about the global or international scene and remind folks of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was developed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at its 21st Conference of the Parties, COP21, in 2015. It was available for signature by nations between April 2016 and 2017, and it was defined as going into force when ratified by 55 parties accounting for 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That threshold was met on October the 4th, 2016, and it actually happened on November the 4th, 2016. And if you cast your mind back, you will realize something rather dramatic happened in November of 2016. The basis for the Paris Agreement is a set of nationally determined contributions. The signatories to the Paris Agreement all agreed that they would take certain steps to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And what we're about to do is come up to COP26, where the nations are going to revisit their NDCs, as they're called. The target in the Paris Agreement was that we should not cause warming to be more than 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels by ever. We should just not allow warming to occur greater than that amount. Better, they said, we should try and target only 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. COP22 in Marrakesh happened from November the 7th to the 18th, 2016. You can see that was happening just after the previous presidential election. And what the international nations agreed to do was that despite the fact that President Trump had declared that he was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, all the other nations that were part of that agreement agreed they were going to continue even without the United States. In October, that was signed by 195 of 197 nations, Syria and the US are the only ones that remained unsigned. I think Syria has since joined the agreement. So coming up in 2021, COP26 will happen in Glasgow. And with a bit of luck, the United States will rejoin the Paris Agreement. There is a problem with the Paris Agreement. Remember, it was based on purely voluntary agreements. And this is what's likely to be happening if we take no action at all. By 2100, we're likely to be at 4.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial. Even with the current in individual nationally determined contributions, we're still up at 3.6 degrees centigrade. And remember, the Paris Agreement was for us to be 2 degrees centigrade or less above pre-industrial. So the problem with the Paris Agreement was it did involve an international agreement, but the individually determined contributions of the nations that signed on weren't enough to get where they recognized we needed to be. So that agreement, a good starting point, is not going to get us where we want to go. We need to do more. What I want to do is talk a little about national efforts to address greenhouse gas emissions. Most people have heard about greenhouse gas emissions caps or greenhouse gas emissions taxes, often commonly called carbon caps or carbon taxes. And I just wanted to identify what the basic mechanisms are that are involved in these approaches. It's really a two-step process, which I will illustrate right now. The first question to ask ourselves is, how are we going to reduce emissions? One way is to cap emissions, so to say of a given jurisdiction, which could be a state, a nation. What we're going to say is this jurisdiction is going to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted in a year and lower the cap for those emissions. We're going to cap them and lower the cap over time. The other mechanism that we have heard about is what's called a tax or a fee on emissions. And what this does is essentially say, we are going to put a fee on the greenhouse gas emissions that result from your activities. And what we're going to do is raise that fee over time to discourage you from doing what you're doing that results in emissions. Both of these are described as market-based systems for addressing the lack of a price for the climate pollution that we are producing. At the moment, greenhouse gas emissions are not, in Oregon, particularly in the United States, there's no penalty for emitting greenhouse gases regardless of what you do. The first question is, how do we limit the emissions? And the second question is, if the process that we're using raises money, when clearly the tax raises money, what are we going to do with the funds that we raise? One option is simply to return those funds to taxpayers, and that's the basic dividend approach. So you will hear a lot of people talking about a tax and dividend, or a fee and dividend, which means putting a price on the emissions and then returning the money that's generated back to the taxpayers. This is the approach that the Citizens Climate Lobby uses, and it's, as I said, it's called a fee and dividend or a tax and dividend approach. But there are other things that we can do with funds that are raised. One is to lower other taxes, maybe income taxes or corporate taxes or whatever. British Columbia has that approach. It's called a tax and shift approach, sometimes termed revenue neutral. And other things we can do with funds that are raised are promote energy conservation, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. We can address social injustice issues. We can promote carbon capture and sequestration techniques, or we can promote the adaptation that we need to engage in to help us get through the inevitably changing climate. question we do have to ask is, what's our target for addressing greenhouse gas emissions? Are we going to target carbon dioxide or all of the greenhouse gases measured in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent? And I would submit it's definitely the second of these that we have to target, bearing in mind that 35–40% of the warming is a result of other gases besides carbon dioxide. Should we just look at the end use of fossil fuels, the combustion of the fossil fuels and the emissions that are resulting from that? Or do we need to look at the full life cycle? And remember, the natural gas problem is really a problem of the leakage of methane at the process of extracting the natural gas. And so my submission is we need to look at the entire life cycle of the process. Is it just fossil fuels, or do we need to look at industrial processes as well? And if you remember the charts which showed where emissions were coming from, you will see that industrial processes resulted in a small but not inconsequential percentage of the emissions. So we do need to look at industrial processes as well as just fossil fuel use. Another question is, should we be applying whatever technique we apply, whether it's a cap or a tax, upstream as the energy enters the economy, where we have very few entities that we're targeting? We're simply looking, if we're looking at fossil fuels, for example, we're looking at the importers of the fossil fuel into the jurisdiction, the state or whatever, or those who are extracting the fossil fuels from the ground. Or do we look downstream and do we target with our cap or our tax the end users of fossil fuels, for example? The problem with that is we then have everybody, each of us is going to be an entity that's going to be targeting with the tax or the cap. And that becomes very administratively unwieldy. What kind of a goal should we have? What percent reduction compared to what date? By when? Remember, the Paris Agreement said no more than 2 degrees centigrade, 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial 1750 conditions, or better, 1.5 degrees. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018 argued that 2 degrees that the Paris agreements offered was just not good enough. They looked at a whole array of consequences of warming and said, no, 1.5 degrees centigrade is as high as we can afford to go if we don't want to result in some major substantial disruptions in life on the planet. In terms of actual emissions, the IPCC again in 2018 argued that greenhouse gas emissions need to be down 45% below 2010 levels by 2030, and we must be at net zero by 2050 if we're going to save ourselves from a really problematic global temperature increase. Let's have a look at how the cap and the tax approach work. With the cap of greenhouse gas emissions cap approach, what we do is establish within a jurisdiction a cap on fossil fuels according to the emissions resulting from their use, and industrial processes according to the emissions that their processes produce. Then we lower that cap on a predetermined trajectory, therefore reducing the amount of emissions that are allowed from fossil fuels or industrial processes. If we want to do this, we can do it based on what's called an in-boundary or sector inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, or a consumption-based inventory. Now, in-boundary inventory means we just look, for example, in Oregon, we just look within the boundary of the state at the emissions that are resulting inside the state. If we look at consumption inventory, then we're going to have to start assessing the emissions that result from the TVs that are made that we buy here. That becomes much more difficult to target. we have to ask, who's going to be regulated? Is it going to be all sectors of the economy? Is it going to be jurisdiction-wide? All emitters? Now, if we say anybody who emits, anything that emits carbon dioxide or a greenhouse gas has to be regulated, that means each of us in our respiration, because we breathe out carbon dioxide. Or are we going to limit it to large emitters, say, and this is the usual approach, emitters of 25,000 or more metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases per annum. That's the much more common approach to take. We're going to have some kind of allowance that polluters are going to be able to buy to allow them to emit up to the limit. That can be allocated to them. It could be allocated to them free, or they could be purchasing those at a fixed price, or those allowances could be auctioned, and that's the most common approach that's used. Or allowances are auctioned, and currently in California, that auction is running at about $15 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions. There might be some allowances even within an auction or a fixed price system to compensate for utilities, so that the price of electricity or gas for low-income residents the price increase isn't too great. Also, there could be some free allowances that are allocated to reduce the likelihood of industries just picking up and moving out of the state and not saving emissions overall. Then, for the system to operate, it's going to have penalties. So there has to be some kind of a penalty for those who do not comply with the system. The advantage to the cap approach is it comprises a direct regulation of emissions. The price is indirect because if it's done by auction, it can vary according to what the market demands, but the actual reduction in emissions is a direct one. And we as a jurisdiction, as a state, can say we want our emissions to go down from our 65 million metric tons per annum at a predetermined rate, and then we lower the number of allowances year by year, so we keep the emissions going down. The pricing is indirect, as I said, if it's based on an auction. Polluters, those who are emitting, can trade any allowances that they don't use to other entities that maybe can't reduce their emissions so rapidly. And this system usually allows some offsets, and I'm going to explain these in just a second. So, supposing we have an industry that's producing emissions, and let's argue that it has obtained allowances that will allow it to emit this amount of greenhouse gases, but it's finding it difficult to do that, and so it's emitting more than its allowances permit it to emit. So what can they do? One thing they can do is pay the penalty, but they can, according to the systems that are in operation, they can solve that problem one of two ways. One is, imagine over here we have another industry. They bought their allowances, so they have this number of allowances, emissions allowances, and they found it relatively easy to reduce their emissions. So their emissions are only amounting to that much. So what you can see is they've now bought a whole bunch of allowances that they're not going to use. So one thing they can do is sell them to this outfit over here, and that will allow this outfit, this industry, to use these unused allowances to compensate for the excess emissions. And so that's what emissions credit trading is all about. This company, which has done a great job of reducing its emissions, not only does gets a reward in that it's reduced its emissions, but it has sold its excess emission allowances to this company on the open marketplace. And so these credits can be sold at in the open market, and they can get money in addition to the business that they're engaged in. So that's the system of credits. The offset works slightly differently. So now imagine we have Farmer Brown who wants to grow a forest, but he doesn't quite have the money, or she doesn't quite have the money to invest in growing the forest. What that person can do is sell the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that they might capture in their forest, right? They can sell that to the company that's producing too many emissions. So they pay the farmer to grow the trees that capture the carbon dioxide that compensates for the excessive emissions that this company is producing. And that's what offsets are all about. It's a way of growing forests, it's a way of promoting regenerative agriculture, and it's a way of stimulating wind turbine farms and solar farms as well, because they can fit into this method also. So now, how does the tax fee approach work? What this involves is the direct imposition of a fee on fossil fuels or industrial processes according to the emissions that they produce. It assumes that the added price of that tax or fee will encourage the utility or the fossil fuel user to transition to renewable energy. And as the costs are passed on to the consumers, you and me, what that does is encourage us to look for products that are manufactured in ways that do not involve fossil fuels use or industrial processes that result in emissions. Because when we find products that aren't emitting, we're not going to be paying the fee that's being passed on to us. The fee often proposed in the tax fee approach starts at $15 per ton, and then it rises until the goals of the program are met. Unfortunately, one of the things that we discovered, Portland State University undertook a study back in 2013, which indicated, not indicted, a price of $150 per ton would not achieve Oregon's goals for greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. So what often happens, as you can see, is folks propose a $15 a ton fee, but it's nowhere near enough to do what we need to do. This approach is, and I indicated this one earlier, this approach is indirect in terms of its impact on greenhouse gas emissions, although it's direct in terms of the price that it's charging for emissions. The problem with this is, in an expanding economy, folks might just suck up the price, the fee, the tax, as the price of doing business, and then just continue emitting anyway. And that can be a problem with the tax or fee approach. Let's illustrate the problem that I just referred to. I'm just trying to get my screenshots out of the way. The Northwest Economic Research Center at Portland State University conducted a study on the carbon tax approach. Oregon's goal for 2035 in terms of our emissions was down here, and our goal in terms of 2050 emissions was down here. And what this modeling system suggested was that none of the pricing amounts that were suggested, and down here you can see $10, $30, $40, $60, $100, $120, $150 a ton of emissions, none of those prices actually by 2050 35 and so forth, we're going to get Oregon where we needed to be. We needed to be here, and they all, some of them actually seemed to do a good job initially, but then they tailed off with time in terms of their effectiveness. So this is the point that I was making earlier. $150 a ton of a fee on emissions doesn't get us where we need to go. One of the things that's worth looking at is how, what kind of excuse me, I'm trying to move the image so I can see my screen. What kind of a reduction percentage rate gets us to where we want to go? We're looking at, the light blue is 5% rate of reduction, 8, 9, 10, 15%. So if we want to get close to net zero by 2050, we need to be on a very steep reductions trajectory for our emissions. The problem that this illustrates is every year we put off action, the steepness of that trajectory to reach the goal of net zero by 2050 or something approaching that is going to have to get steeper and steeper. So the sooner we start on this effort, the easier it's going to be. Now, this chart is showing us that across the planet, there are a number of places that are indeed having some kind of a global emissions trading system similar to the processes that we were just talking about a moment ago. 61 jurisdictions, 46 national, 32 subnational jurisdictions have some kind of a mechanism for regulating greenhouse gas emissions, and that amounts to 23% of global emissions. So there are places around the world that are doing something worthwhile, and these places are to be encouraged. We should encourage our state to do whatever we can. The emissions reduction scorecard identifies those nations that are leaders. We have Morocco, Gambia, India, Costa Rica, and the European Union. Nations that are promising in terms of their efforts are Norway, China, the United Kingdom. The asterisks are nations that are already compliant with their IPCC targets. And barely trying are a few nations over here. These are nations that are simply not doing what it needs to be done. And you can see that includes the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the Ukraine. If we're going to make some serious effort to address greenhouse gas emissions, we need to be amongst the leaders. Amongst the barely trying, obviously doesn't cut it. There are a number of efforts in the United States that are relevant here. And I've just scrolled through these very quickly. They're a bit too busy, I think, for you to read them in detail, but they just give you a quick clue as to what's happening. New York, for example, has 100% reduction from 1990 levels by 2050 with interim goals. So that's where we need to be. Vermont, not quite as good. New Hampshire, not quite as good. Rhode Island, not really. So some states are making a really good effort at trying to reduce their emissions. If we come over to the west, Arizona, there's California, 200 level is 200 levels by 2010, but the main thing is 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Washington is looking at 95% below 2005 levels by 2050. And now Oregon had legislation passed in 2007, which targeted 75% below 1990 levels by 2050. But now we have, with the governor's executive order, 45% below 1990 levels by 2035 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Let's have a quick look at the different kinds of action that are going on around the country. Federally, we have Senate Bill 940, which is the Healthy Climate and Family Security Act, has a goal of 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. Another federal action is House Resolution 763, the Innovative Energy and Carbon Dividend Act, a fee and dividend approach, 9% below 2016 by 2050. There's a 100% Clean Economy Act passed the House in May of 2019, and this was pretty irrelevant, didn't say very much, but it did urge us to stay in the Paris Agreement and achieve our nationally determined contribution. We have House Resolution 109, which recognizes the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal. This grew out of the Green New Deal, and that targets net zero emissions by 2050 and an emphasis on social justice. There's the Climate Leadership and Environmental Action for Our Nation. CLEAN is what that spells out, targeting net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and it has a sector by sector approach. Let's have a quick look at what's happening in Oregon. In 2007, Oregon passed House Bill 3543, which dealt with regulated greenhouse gas emissions and identified these goals. 75% below 1990 level by 2050. This was purely voluntary. It established the Oregon Global Warming Commission and the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. Because we have obviously been nowhere near on that trajectory. Between 2015 and 2018, several bills were proposed in the legislature and they all failed. Then most recently in 2019, we had House Bill 2020, a cap, trade, and invest proposal. And in 2020, Senate Bill 1530, a cap, trade, and invest proposal. And this is the problem that we are facing in Oregon because of illustrating that we are not on the trajectory we want to be. You can see a very great deal of similarity between this chart and what I showed you earlier. The bottom line is electricity production, transportation, residential, commercial, and industrial and agricultural activity in Oregon. And you can see on the vertical axis, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. That line takes us to where we were in 1990, and you can see from 1990 towards 2017, emissions in Oregon rose, fluctuated, and dropped a little. The red dashed line represents projected emissions into the future given current policy. You'll see this rather strange drop at 2030, and that's because in 2016, Oregon passed the Coal to Clean Bill, Senate Bill 1547. And what that stated was electricity in Oregon, used in Oregon, shall no longer be generated in power plants that use coal, whether that's generated in Oregon or outside Oregon. And what the models do is, I think, assume that that is going to happen suddenly rather than gradually. And so that's why at this point, everything drops. And you can see the real drop is in emissions resulting from electricity production. All the other sectors really show no change. It's just electricity production drops because of that Coal to Clean Bill. What we can see here is that if we simply continue with current policies, the excess of emissions over our goal is going to be huge by 2050. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we've been trying to do with the legislation that's being proposed. And that's what the governor is trying to do with the executive order, which we'll get to in just a second. The recent efforts in Oregon on 2019 and 2020, I just mentioned them. 2019 was House Bill 2020. This was Cap, Trade, and Invest, that was thwarted because Republicans walked out of the legislature at that point when that legislation was about to be discussed. They walked out of the Senate. Then in 2020, another Cap, Trade, and Invest bill was proposed, Senate Bill 1530. And at that point, the Republicans walked out of both chambers. And that didn't just eliminate any further discussion of the climate bill, but that thwarted discussion on a whole range of other bills that were under discussion by the legislature during that session. Because the governor had committed that 2020 will be the year of climate action, and the legislation didn't pass, what happened was she signed into order Executive Order 2004, which established some goals for Oregon, and we'll just get through those very quickly. This charged Oregon's state agencies, 16 agencies of the 125 that are out there, to undertake steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within activities that are under their purview. The goal was 45% below 1990 level by 2035 and 80% below 1990 level by 2050. State agencies were charged with exercising their authority and discretion to further achievement of these goals in a cost-effective manner, prioritizing actions helping vulnerable populations and impacted communities. This is a list of the agencies that were involved. They also have a working group. So now a working group that's involved in protecting impacted communities. So now we have a statewide coalition of concerned Oregonians that are working on helping to make sure the rulemaking associated with this Oregon Climate Action Plan is effective. There are 7 teams looking at cap and reduce, transportation, construction, building codes, appliance efficiency, clean energy, public utilities, natural and working lands, public health, and environmental justice and impacted communities. If you're interested in getting involved in making sure that the rulemaking is effective in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and serving the goal of social justice, please contact me and I'll try and get you involved in the process. In terms of local activities, we have a number of cities and counties around Oregon that have developed their own climate and energy action plans. You can see where we live, Ashland and Talon have done it. It would be nice to see Medford get involved in that. In fact, they were about to get involved until the legislation failed in the last session. My last slide before I stop is going to introduce you to something that Southern Oregon Climate Action Now has been doing, and that is we have interviewed candidates on climate and the environment. We have 30-minute interviews with candidates from Jackson, Josephine, and Curry counties seeking state, House, and Senate seats and the County Board of Commissioner seats. If you're interested in looking at those interviews, they're available at socan.eco/2020-interviews. And just to remind you, if you want to look at individual action items on the SOCAN webpage, that reminds you that that's the URL for that page. And that brings me to the end. And I'm sorry, I can see we've got maybe 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen, for sharing with us on this topic.
Thank you. Anybody got any questions, please shoot them to me, alan@socan.eco. Be glad to try and answer them. Thank you.
Thank you.